So this is a panel on public policy in New Hampshire. Is Director of Energy Transition for Clean Energy New Hampshire, and State Senator Rebecca White from White River Junction, and State Representative George Sykes from Lebanon, who serves on the New Hampshire House Transportation Committee, which deals with some of the policies around EVs and such. So I see Chris has some slides, so why don't we start with Chris? And if you'd like to do a little bit more introduction about yourself, that's fine too.
I'm the most junior here, not elected person. So Chris Skoglund, Director of Energy Transition, Clean Energy New Hampshire, based in Concord, New Hampshire.
And I'm Senator Rebecca White, and I serve the town of Hartford, Vermont, and Windsor County at large with Senator Allison Clarkson and Senator Dick McCormick.
And George?
I'm George Sykes. I'm a member of the New Hampshire House and a ranking member for the Transportation Committee. And as I said earlier, we take up all manner of transportation-related issues, but not roads and bridges.
And I'm Clifton Below, the Assistant Mayor of the City of Lebanon, sort of helping moderate this, but also serve as chair of the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire.
And so I'm Chris Skoglund. I'm the Director of Energy Transition with Clean Energy New Hampshire, longtime resident of New Hampshire, but was born in Vermont, in St. Johnsbury, doing missionary work here in the Granite State. Previously, I worked for the state for 14 years and then came when I had an opportunity to work a little bit more focused on clean energy in order to move what I saw as being New Hampshire's goals forward. I have some slides that I've put together, and rather than take up time talking about myself, I will provide those just as some background that then Senator Whitley and Representative, what is your last name? Sykes. I'm just going to move through them pretty quickly. The slides will be available after, and I'm more than happy to stay and ask for questions. Just really quickly, the organization I'm with is Clean Energy New Hampshire. We advocate for the clean energy transition to improve the economy, communities, and the environment. Next slide. What we are noting is that, like, the EV transition, as some of you may have heard in the last presentation, is moving forward very quickly. We're seeing adoption of EVs internationally, and the US is, next slide, right where, or it's lagging in the sense that we're about 5 to 7% of new vehicles are electric. But that puts us in line with where Norway was less than a decade ago. They're at now 90% sales of EVs. So we're looking at what could be a big jump. And next slide. This is consistent with what we have seen globally and historically in terms of the adoption of new technologies. Very slow uptake, whether it's cell phones, personal computers, these sorts of things. Computers used to be in rooms, now they're on our phones. And so electric vehicles may seem something like relatively exotic, but 100 years ago, 30% of vehicles on the road were actually electric. They had benefits over combustion engines. And so what we're seeing for projections in New England, sorry, I'm being distracted by small children outside. For April 2022, ISO New England, the regional grid manager, projected that we would see about 1.5 million EVs on the road by 2031. A growth of almost 3,000% over the 50,000 EVs that were on the road in 2021, 2022 in all of New England. New Hampshire, in contrast, had about a 3,000 to 5,000, depends on the year that you look at. So this is where they were expecting that we would see that massive growth. But advance 1 year, and taking into account the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, that 1.5 million jumped to what they expect to be 2.2 million vehicles on the road in all of New England, with now 1.5 million vehicles on the road in Massachusetts alone. This is consistent with all of ISO New England's forecasts, which tend to be conservative. Every year they make new updates, and they're always projecting higher and higher and higher. Going out to just one more year, they would expect to see an additional 500,000 vehicles on the road in all of New England that are EV. Now, this is just for New England. We have possibly faster growth that could be happening in the Canadian provinces, principally in Quebec, as they push to electrify their entire economy. Next slide. Now, why does this matter? New Hampshire is actually projected to grow the slowest, while we might see a 40 times to 50 times the number of EVs on the road today. In 2031, 2032, New Hampshire could only see possibly 10 times, a much slower uptake in EVs. So that might seem like we have less of a change that we need to prepare for. The challenge is that the number 2 portion of our economy is driven by travel and tourism, whether it's coming from the north or it's coming from the south. I'm from Durham, and my exposure to travelers and tourists is from all over, whether it's people from Quebec wearing bathing suits that are entirely too small to go to the beach, or people from Massachusetts coming up for the day. But we see this all over. Next slide. And each part of the economy is going to be getting different drivers from different places at different times of year. I know that right now we're all kind of concerned. Did the rain impact the leaves and cause anthracose to go all over the trees, changing the way that we will see leaf peepers coming to the state? Well, we see travelers that are coming in seasonally, annually, and that has big impacts on what we are going to need to do in order to attract those drivers from the north, from the south. Next slide. Because up to 50% of our, oh, this is the wrong slide, but most of our travelers and tourists are actually coming from Massachusetts. This is very significant because that's where we're going to see the most growth in electric vehicles over the next decade and in the future. They are leading on the entire energy transition. They have incentives in place to promote EVs, and those drivers are looking for destinations to come to. Next slide. New Hampshire has a certain number of electric vehicle charging that we would need just to meet that 10 times growth in our own EVs. But if we are looking at travelers and tourists from all over the region, if we are, and actually they are looking to possibly go to Vermont. So to that respect, Senator Whitley and I are now in competition. We're going to need far more EV charging, public EV charging, than we currently have. This morning I drove here and I actually got into a fight with the charger until I realized that it was a private charger on a private lot. So now I need to find some place to go charge my EV so I can get home. Okay, I'll stop right by. So one of the things that I won't focus too much on this, but the idea is that in the future, we're going to need EV charging kind of like, you know, types for horses. We're going to need a combination of the fast charging, but we're going to need charging everywhere. So we're going to need charging where I pull up in front of Lebanon City Hall, plug in my car, could be level 1, could be level 2. But then it allows us to kind of charge all over, have distributed charging. Right now, we don't have those things in place. Partly because EV policy, and I'll start speeding up, EV policy in New Hampshire is limited by what New Hampshire policymakers have been willing to adopt. They're very cautious about adopting out-of-state mandates. In this respect, this slide shows all of the states that have adopted the California Zero Emission Standard. This is one of the things that's driving the adoption of EVs in New Hampshire. Next slide. And that has an impact on our charging. Next slide. Zeroing in, you can actually see that we lag behind all the other states in the region. The ones that we focus on tend to be Vermont and Maine. They have far more charging in place. This slide is out of date, but not in the sense that we still lag behind. Yep. And when you zero in and look at New Hampshire for the non-Tesla network, this is what people see. This is what my cousin, a version of a picture that my cousin sends to me as he leaves Concord, Mass, on his way to Vermont, saying, can't stop in New Hampshire, gonna go through Vermont today. So already travelers and tourists are looking in the states and provinces around us and saying, this is problematic. I'm gonna adjust my trip accordingly. Okay, go. And I'll pause here. I have more slides and more information, but one of the things that we face in New Hampshire is skepticism about public investment in the electric vehicle charging network, for the public charging. I've specifically heard some policymakers express concerns that EVs are only for the wealthy. They are not for the low income or for those on fixed income. And in that case, they were implying they're not for seniors that are no longer part of the workforce. Therefore, there's a discrete pool of individuals that will be driving those EVs. What we're seeing in the states around us is that EVs are going to be for everyone. And if we're going to be an economy that can function regionally, we need to have lots of public charging. Unfortunately, in New Hampshire, we have very limited public charging. Most of the dollars will be coming from the federal level with very limited, if any, kind of coming through from New Hampshire sources. This has been something that has been expressed as a reservation by the New Hampshire legislature and then more intensely by the New Hampshire PUC. In like other states, we are seeing tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in this transition. As my kids know, I can talk forever, so I'm going to now cede the floor to my other speakers.
And this is Senator Becca White. We have a Senator Rebecca Whitley who goes by the name Becky. I'm sorry, Becky Whitley. So this is Becca White.
I'm Becca White. I serve in the Vermont State Senate. I represent Windsor County along with Senator Dick McCormick and Senator Allison Clarkson. I was previously in the State House as a representative for the town of Hartford. So if you're here today and you were called to hear about a topic around what role can be played in politics, you're probably wondering, after hearing Chris's phenomenal presentation, well, Vermont is so much further ahead on this. What the heck could I be doing? So I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about some of the policies that we've worked on in Vermont and then where folks can get involved, because we are further along than maybe our neighbors in New Hampshire, but we still have challenges when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. So the first place to start is with the intention that Vermont has around greenhouse gas emissions and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Vermont has passed a law called the Global Warming Solutions Act. If you're familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act, it was a landmark piece of legislation that turned our greenhouse gas emission goals into requirements, and they put forward a legal mechanism so that Vermonters could take our state to task if we do not actually meet those requirements, meaning that there is a mechanism for Vermonters to say, hey, you're not actually hitting those goals that you set. We will now take you to court. This is not like a court case where, 10 Vermonters would get multi-millions of dollars. Instead, it would be through rulemaking so that there could be a push for rulemaking, meaning that we'd have to do the things that we said we would do in the plan. Out of the Global Warming Solutions Act came something called the Climate Action Plan, which was created by the Climate Council. That organization put out that climate action plan as a suite of tools that the state could use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which if you're here, you're probably familiar with why we care about greenhouse gas emissions, because they are the driving factor around climate change. But our largest sector within that plan that we need to reduce in Vermont is transportation. Second to that is thermal, so heating and cooling our homes. But over 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions as Vermonters comes from our transportation sector. So it's really like the richest area that we could go for. Also one of the hardest to respond to because of its individual nature. So I served on House Transportation for 4 years, and one of the key policies that we worked on in that committee was the Transportation Innovation Act, the TIA. And the goal there was to include inside the T-bill, which is the yearly transportation budget, like the budget that funds all of the Agency of Transportation, all of DMV, that budget has to pass. That's considered a must-pass bill. So we moved a bill called the Transportation Innovation Act to be included within the transportation budget. So that's like the first place I want to stop and just say, if you're wondering what your role could be in advocating for electric vehicles, it would be following that path, following the transportation budget bill in the Vermont House, known as the T-bill, and kind of seeing where the money is in relation to electric vehicle, public vehicle charging infrastructure, or just incentives, or the policies. All of that is kind of wrapped into that T-bill that we call the T-bill. And the Transportation Innovation Act was meant to be incorporating those concepts into the T-bill. So that was the first big piece of policy I wanted to talk about. And then the second one is something called the Transportation Climate Initiative, TCI. And that's not a Vermont specific policy. That's actually a regional and multi-state proposal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector as a collective, similar to what we did with RGGI. So if you're familiar with the Regional Energy Greenhouse Gas Inventory, thank you. I know I always want to throw an E there. But it's RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Thank you. Chris is on it. Got my acronyms down. So RGGI is essentially the blueprint for what the Transportation Climate Initiative would do, but in the transportation sector. And that would draw funding to Vermont if we successfully reduce our emissions. And it's a policy that we've seen different states kind of hold on to for a period of time and move the ball forward. But then we have a lot of states, it basically has become like a football that seems to be getting tossed back and forth on what state's going to start it, who's going to take charge. And you both have to have your governor be on board and your legislature be on board. And in New England in particular, oh, hey, look, we're on the screen now. In New England in particular, we have usually divided legislators. So we've got Republican governor, democratically run legislature, vice versa. You know, it's like different states have different setups. So to have both legislature and governor on board has seemingly derailed some of the Transportation Climate Initiative regional conversation. So I'll just end my comments with 2 points. I've talked about the 2 big pieces of legislation that I worked on and that you can follow moving forward. Anything to do with the T-bill in Vermont is a value if you're wondering how to involve yourself in EV conversations. You could connect with the Sierra Club, for example, who have an advocate in the State House on this topic, VPIRG, Vermont Public Interest Research Group, Vermonters for VNRC, all VCW, I mean, all the acronyms of good environmental organizations, you can track them and follow the policy that they're working on and kind of tune into their advocacy alerts or their actions either on the transportation bill or the larger regional conversation. But the last thing I wanted to talk about was equity. So equity and electric vehicles go hand in hand. And one of the key things that we hear in Vermont that sounds like you've also heard in New Hampshire is this idea that electric vehicles are only for the elite. They're only for rich people. In fact, I had a disagreeing person, like he's not even a lobbyist. He just like kind of hangs around. This guy who just hangs around in the State House, which I don't know if you guys get those too. We have a few, I know, yeah. We have a few just loose cannons who just kind of don't seem to have anything better to do but like be in the Vermont State House. One of these gentlemen felt that it was very necessary to explain to me that there's no way that I could purport to be low income or middle income and own an electric vehicle, that I was clearly a liar, that was impossible. I then had to explain to him, which is really too bad because he sat through testimony on the very program I used, but I had to explain to him that we actually used the electric vehicle incentives that were matched to our tiered income that allowed us to afford to be able to have an electric vehicle, so that the cost of our electric vehicle was less than a gas car. And we now pay, comparing it to around $100 a month in gas, to $30 in total for all of our driving and our like electric bill. So actually it was very beneficial as a low income person for me to have an electric vehicle. So equity and the programs that we work on in Vermont are really the driving force for us now, is how do we have equity within electric vehicle distribution so that we don't just have enclaves of people in Norwich or Woodstock who have electric vehicles, but then no one in Hartford or no one in Springfield. So the way that we did that was a program called Mileage Smart and a program called Replace Your Ride. And if you're interested in either of those, happy to talk about them, but they're policy decisions that we made around electric vehicles and are critical for EV adoption, because the people who experience climate change at its most severe are also the people who are most likely to be left out of the solutions. So we need to highlight equity in our electric vehicle transition. So that's all I wanted to share.
Great, thank you. Representative George Sykes, who's also a Lebanon City Councilor.
Good morning, everybody. So I have a rather different picture to paint, as you might imagine. New Hampshire is a very challenging environment for all of these topics. I think there's a lot of inherent systemic issues, not least of which I'll make a little bit of fun about myself. We have 400 state legislators, and they are paid $100 a year, which is a citizen's legislature, which I view as a positive. The bad side of that is that younger folks and lower income folks are really challenged to be able to be part of that legislature. And that in itself leads to a somewhat more conservative point of view, never mind any logos you may see on the state license plate. So there's that inherent difficulty to begin with. That said, there are some other built-in systemic problems that you as citizens, by the way, you as citizens can make a difference in that, because while we have 400, there's only an average of 3,300 people in each district. And it doesn't take much to change who your representatives might be. I don't want to put too much politics into this, but I would say that I would ask that one step that you can make is when you are determining, A, I want you to vote, and B, when you do vote, I want you to look at their record relative to EV adoption, energy savings, and so on and so forth. And that's one of the most positive things that you can do right away, because we do have elections every 2 years, and every 2 years things change. All right, moving on. Because of this inherent conservatism that we have particularly in the New Hampshire House, but also elsewhere in the government, we have failed to adopt, I think they're called CAFE standards, and yep. Yep.
CAFE standards are nationwide standards.
Right.
The California Zero Emission Standards is the one that I showed the first map of.
Okay, understood, but we've not done either, as I understand it.
The CAFE standards are applied to auto manufacturers. It's minimums
Okay.
that they need to meet.
All right. So one of the things that happens because we don't have these standards is that if you've tried to buy an electric vehicle in New Hampshire, it's an issue. I've tried to buy one in the past, and they just, they weren't available in New Hampshire. I'd have to go to Vermont to get one, which, as a local person, really stuck in, my craw. I want to spend my money in New Hampshire to help my New Hampshire neighbors. Anyway, so that's one thing. Second thing is that I have, by the way, I'm the ranking member on the Transportation Committee, and just so we're clear about this, in the Hampshire House, Transportation Committee does planes, trains, automobiles, bicycles, boats, everything, including all the regulations that go with the operation of those types of vehicles. We don't do roads and bridges. So that's, but that's why this is a perfect committee to be looking at these kinds of issues. On top of that, we have opportunities that have come our way in terms of funding that is, even though I've participated in several commissions to talk about spending Volkswagen dollars. For those of you not familiar with that, there was Volkswagen falsified their records about the mileage that they were getting in order to make their diesel engines sell better. And they had something in their computer chips that would falsify that data. They settled with many different states. New Hampshire got a lot of money. That money was, policy decision was made to spend that money on electric vehicle infrastructure. We have gone through, I don't know how many bid cycles, at least a couple. But I'm querying that because it's not my area of expertise.
That may be covered in the next session.
Okay, fair enough. So that's an issue as well. So I guess what I'm trying to share with you is that I also take what I would consider for political reasons of what I'll call the long view. Because I'm in an environment, and we live in an environment that's inherently conservative, change will happen, but it must happen incrementally. And so I would suggest to you that besides the voting issue, I would suggest that you take a look at particular issues that are important to you relative to these types of questions, and begin the efforts necessary to educate policymakers so that they, for instance, I'm sorry, I've forgotten. Chris alluded to the fact that there, well, why is public money being spent on public charging? And what I hear is phrased slightly differently. It is, well, we didn't have to spend public money to get all the gas stations we need. Why are we going to have to spend money to get the electric infrastructure that we need? And I rebut that with, well, we can be a town that didn't put in its railroad station and everything passed it by. Or we could be a town that didn't put in the transportation infrastructure in terms of interstates. And a perfect example of that, not that I'm denigrating our neighbors, but Claremont, for instance, no interstate. It really stifled economic development in that community for years and years and years. And so why wouldn't we be trying to make it possible for one of the biggest income generators in our state, tourism, to be more accessible to people? That would be for the public good, hence the desire to spend public dollars to make this happen. So the final piece that I would just mention, and it's not off topic because it's part of the whole environment that we work in terms of politically in New Hampshire, and I think that was the purpose of today's meeting. As long as it's lovely if you live in New Hampshire and you don't own a house, for instance, your tax burden is probably 46th lowest in the country. If you do own a house in New Hampshire, it's the 48th highest. The state is perpetually starved for money. And that's an inherent system that needs to be, we need to fix that. And I understand that everybody's challenged by their property taxes, but in the meantime, your conservative legislature is eliminating other sources of revenue. A source of revenue for $230 million for the state budget is going away next year. Business' enterprise tax. That'll be $230 million that just disappears, and there's no plan to replace it. What's going to be cut? Or will we continue to pay higher and higher property taxes? So it's a challenging environment, but my final watchwords for people who would like to see change in this area is that, and I say this often, if it was the right thing to do today, it'll be the right thing to do tomorrow, and it'll be the right thing to do the year after. And so we must really be focused on making these changes in the state so that we can bring New Hampshire along with the rest of the country.
Good. Thank you. Excuse me. One other thing I'd like to mention, we're in this area served by Liberty Utilities, and they currently have a rate case. And one of the good things about one thing they're proposing in that is to take their three-part time of use rate and offer it for whole house. Currently, there's a three-part time of use rate that you can sign up for EV charging. But the problem is it's separate from your regular count. So if you have solar on your roof, you can't use it to charge your vehicle. But a whole house rate will allow that. And the half of all the hours, all weekends and overnight from 8 at night till 8 in the morning would be at about half the regular rate. Midday would be about the regular rate, and then there's 4 hours in the late afternoon, early evening that would be quite a bit more expensive. But the effect of that is it even make it more sense to have an EV if you can charge it overnight, it would be at a lower rate. So that's a bit of progress. And through the Community Power Coalition in New Hampshire, the city of Lebanon, as well as Enfield, Plainfield, and Hanover are all participating in that docket to help achieve that goal, among others. So let's open this up to questions or comments from anybody in the room or online. Anybody got any thoughts or questions? Yes, sir. Oh, if you might come to the microphone, then it'll be on the recording of this program.
Yes, it's on?
Yeah. Is it on?
You can hear it? Okay.
Yeah,
My name is Ben Steele. I'm on Sustainable Hanover.
Okay.
And one question that occurred to me just while you were talking is recently there's been some talk about how is New Hampshire going to fund roads and bridges, because it's funded primarily with a gasoline tax. And if everybody has EVs, there's one suggestion is to have a registration extra fee for an EV. So what do you think about that? I bet Chris has an idea.
Well, there's the short-term answer and then the long-term answer. Just on September 1st, there was a provision in HB 2 that came from, I think, Senate Bill 191 that instituted a $100 flat fee for all EVs and a $50 flat fee for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles at the time of registration. And this was to provide some measure of contribution to the highway fund, which apparently Representative Sykes has no oversight of. But that does allow, at least until we come up with a long-term solution. So for some cars, they may be overcharged. A car like myself, where we drive 25,000 miles a year in our EV, we actually are getting a break compared to someone who's paying the typical road toll. But at least it starts so that all vehicles are providing something. But then there's also HB 412 this past session that created a commission to look at funding for highways and bridges, because due to the CAFE standard, vehicles have been getting more and more efficient overall. So there's less contribution to the highway fund in general, regardless of whether it's an EV or not. And so we need to be looking at other opportunities to fund. And one thing that they've been looking at is there a mileage-based fee and a weight-based fee? And that's flat across all vehicles, irrespective of fuel type. Yeah. Over to Representative Sykes.
Senator White?
No. So I turned it off. In Vermont, we have had this exact same debate, and our main driver has not been electric vehicle adoption that's been bringing down our gas tax revenue, but higher efficiency trucks actually have been our main issue. It's your lovely new Tacoma 4x4. That's really what's screwing us at the pump, not the 2% of electric vehicle adoption. So what we've decided is to delay charging electric vehicles at a different rate, like a registration fee. I mean, our guideline has been once we get to 15% purchased or sales, that's when we'll actually institute something, because the administrative overhead to do it is actually pretty much right level until you get to about 15%. So what we've explored instead is what Oregon has done, which is they've started to experiment with a per mile charge, but that's on all vehicles, because essentially we see this as a transition, not where we'll have gas vehicles be the majority anymore, but we will have electric vehicles be the majority. And we also want to charge higher efficiency vehicles to pay their fair share of the roads as well, because they are putting wear and tear. So we're looking at it for all vehicles and not just electric vehicles. And then the last thing I'd say is fee baits, which is kind of a turn on a little bit of what you're doing, which is if you drive a very high mileage, beautiful top down red Porsche, that costs you 100 grand plus, you're gonna have to pay more when you register, to help subsidize the cost of like a higher efficiency but lower cost vehicle. So the idea would be have an equitable fee bait, is what we call them, like a rebate on some and a fee on others.
So I was quite familiar with these efforts. I would go back to the original premise, however. New Hampshire is, as I earlier spoke, is perpetually starved for cash. And roads and bridges are no different. The city of Lebanon, for instance, is somewhat emblematic of the entire state, where we have maybe 30% of the money we need to resurface roads when, and yet we have 92 miles of road. And I don't know if you've driven in the city recently, but, it's challenging. The state is like that and even worse. Now, they are getting more federal money, but not enough. Speaking of federal money and transportation-related issues, one of the good things that you could do as citizens right now, and virtually I think it's every other year, there is the Gasset Plan. That's the governor's, correct. Thank you for that, because I don't do well with acronyms either. But one of the things that they are charged with looking at, no pun intended, is to be looking at alternative methods of transportation in order to be able to afford to do all the work that needs to be done. They have, in fact, thank goodness, because of federal money, not state money, but federal money, they have put more money into that effort. That has a direct bearing on what's happening right here locally. For instance, Advanced Transit has been able to expand their hours on Saturday and nights, and they were able to do that because of the money that was received through that program. But that program, the executive, we have a very different form of government in New Hampshire with an executive council. Talk to me offline later about that if you wish. But those executive councilors are sponsoring a series of hearings throughout the state to discuss the Gasset Plan. The bad news about the Gasset Plan is that it's so-called 10-year plan that really is a 30-year plan because, oh, wait, there's no money. But it is an opportunity to provide feedback. When the Gasset, when the commissioners were here and the executive council was here in the city, the thing that I got up and spoke about was, what are you doing more for alternative forms of transportation to take cars off the road? Put more money into particularly rural transit, was my message. But those are things that you can do that will help with the environment, which is a big part of what we're trying to do with EVs. But I do think, to answer your question more fully, I'm in support of this as a I don't know that it will be a stopgap in New Hampshire, unfortunately, but I do think that we can no longer just have highway revenues deteriorating and deteriorating and deteriorating without finding a way to pay for it. And as there is no political appetite for alternatives, it's something that I feel we have to do.
And just an observation that several of the communities in the Upper Valley, Hartford, Lebanon, Hanover, amongst them, have been working for now, at this point, decades to improve our infrastructure for bicycling. And with the advent of EV bikes, electrified bikes, it's another option to address the equity issue, which is that we're seeing increasingly people from income across the spectrum, but including in particular lower income, can afford to get an EV bike and have it as useful transportation. And we're seeing a growing number of people in Lebanon who are commuting to jobs using the Greenway and some of the other. So that, from a city council point of view, that's something that's ongoing to make the community more bike friendly, not just for recreation, but as a means of transportation that is affordable and lower environmental impact.
I would just add, I'm an e-bike commuter. Woo! I go, yeah, Route 4. It's a great commute route. It's not good. It's very dangerous. Yeah. And I have a lot of blinky lights, and my husband's always like, okay, she'll make it back. I do want to just jump off the e-bike piece, which is, who here is on an energy committee in their town? Maybe you can raise your hand. Oh, we only got one. Two, exactly. So you should be on your energy committee or commission in your town. That's a great way to get involved. Or if you're involved in your local library, for example, I'm very impressed with Norwich and their library in collaboration with Vital Communities and the Lending Library for e-bikes. There's a lot of great hyper-local programs that you can support with your volunteer time that could really use you. So if you want to get involved, that's a great opportunity. And anytime someone is on the energy committee or commission, they already know that I'm going to get their cell phone number and bombard them to run for office. So I assume it's the same in New Hampshire as well.
So any other closing questions or comments by the audience? Or by the panel?
I would just say, maybe this is obvious, but since the question is, what is your role? If you own an electric vehicle or an e-bike, just reference this to your elected official when you see them, because we have lots of senators who have told me that I won't name names, but who have said, there is not a single person in my town who owns an electric vehicle. And then I go, I know at least 2 people who live in your town who own an electric vehicle. So you should just mention this casually if you happen to run into your one of 400 in New Hampshire, because you guys are all neighbors. So mention it that you have an electric vehicle, or that your next vehicle will be an electric vehicle. So you want there to be infrastructure available for you. Or you're exploring it, have an e-bike. That kind of just basic information is so impactful to hear, because it gives us a tool or a person to talk to if it comes up in committees.
I'll just close and kind of build on the energy committee. You can join your energy committee, but what I have noticed at the state legislature, individuals and sometimes nonprofits might be ignored as kind of having a niche perspective. And when the travel and tourism industry or the business industry or municipalities speak up, they represent broader coalitions that represent either ratepayers, taxpayers, or job creators. And if you have any influence with your municipality, with your chamber of commerce, those sorts of voices can often elevate the same message, but catch way more attention saying the exact same thing, and framing it in terms of economic development, not just the environment.
And I would finish with the point that if you were to look, and I'm going to do a little bit of grandstanding for the city of Lebanon, because I also am on the city council. But I would say that Lebanon is punching way above its weight on so many different important issues, whether it's social, environmental, etc. But we are doing that because the citizens of Lebanon are engaged, involved, and they're asking people to speak for them about the issues that are important to them. And so never undersell yourself with that conversation that you have with an elected official, or, keep at it, because it does make a difference.
Thank you. Yeah, and the next program coming up at noon is EV charging at home, at work, or at public charging. Thank you.
Thank you.